Hello, my name's Jake Plant, and this is my oral presentation for Senior Seminar Technology and Society. The chapter I'm covering is pollution. This is in a Horse book. When we talk about pollution, I'm actually going to be pinpointing a certain aspect of pollution. That will be in the area called the Black Triangle. Now, the Black Triangle is an area of basically a communist era that developed after Nazi Germany. Its location is between Poland, Germany and the Czech Republic. And in particular we'll be focusing on Horní Blatna, and that is a village in that area, and in particular a forest on the western front of the Black Triangle. The reason we'll be focusing on this forest is because it went through such a vast change when it came to the industrialisation of that area after Nazi Germany, where this communist era brought in all these factories that brought pollution, and it changed the whole aspect of life in that area of Eastern Europe. Now, the Black Triangle, it was heavily industrialised after the Second World War. Nazi Germany fell, and lots of Eastern Bloc countries were split up, and basically Horní Blatna, the village, is basically what was chosen to be the location of the industrial centre for the Soviets. So the Soviets were heavily influenced in what went along there and what went on. Now, a guy called Barrett Rock, he's from the University of New Hampshire. He decided he was going to do some research around Horní Blatna and the forest on the western front of the Black Triangle to see what he could discover. Basically what Barrett Rock did was to take samples out of the trees, and from those samples he could even tell you what year the industrialisation started, and his findings said it would be 1948. The reason he could tell this is because the samples he took from the tree rings, they started to grow wider. And the reason they grew wider is because of the pollutants that basically meant that the tree rings were very close together rather than wider apart, showing like a stunt in growth, basically, meaning that they were not healthy trees. They were going through a change that basically didn't allow them to grow properly. The reason for the trees having stunted growth is lignite. Lignite is basically the fuel that the Soviets had chosen to use in their factories as an energy source. It's basically a coal type substance, but it's not fully evolved, and it's only halfway to becoming coal. It's all of the properties of lignite suggest that it isn't a very good fuel, but the reason it was used is because it was readily available in that area of Eastern Europe, and it was cheaper. It was the cheapest fuel that was around. The reason it wasn't very good fuel is that it disintegrated very quickly, so you couldn't travel with it. People would not take it elsewhere because it would fall apart and it wouldn't be any good. Pound for pound, it produced less heat and created 4 times more sulfur than coal. So basically, if you had a pound of coal and a pound of lignite, the coal is going to heat up much more and be much more useful and create less pollutants. However, the reason that lignite was chosen, like I said before, was the fact that it was readily available and very cheap. The ethics of this is not good. The Soviets that chose to do this in Horní Blatna, they didn't have the environment at heart, they didn't have the people that lived there at heart. They basically just thought, well, this is what we have, it's cheap, so this is what we're going to use. The mines the mining for the lignite in that area of the country, in the Black Triangle, it only got bigger because the qualities of the coal or of the lignite wasn't as good as coal. They had to keep expanding and keep trying to find more and more and more. So more poor morals by the Soviets were that they would just flatten villages to mine even more lignite. They didn't mind kicking people out of their own homes. They would just flatten the village and mine it for lignite that was buried underneath their homes. Eyewitnesses from the book and from the sources that I've gone through suggest that when you breathe the air in, you actually choke and you're basically essentially poisoning yourself, because there's that much of a smog surrounding the industrialised town because of the lignite they're using to burn. It's creating this huge air pollutant that you can see, you can taste, you can breathe in, and it's really not good for you. So, let alone it not being good for us as humans to breathe it in, but it's also not good for the surrounding environment, particularly this forest on the western front of the Black Triangle. I'll go a little more into detail about the mines, about basically the effects that this had on society in Horni Blatna. There was discrimination against miners, basically meaning that if you are of Romani Gypsy descent, you were forced to go into the mines. You had no choice. That was your call. You were forced to go down there. You were forced to mine this lignite that was not very good, to be honest. They call it Soviet callousness. It's just basically how they didn't really care what they were doing. They knew they had to earn money. They had to provide energy to the country, so they would do whatever it took to do that. The Czechs Czech Republic, as it wasn't really called Czech Republic back then, but the Soviet area where the Czechs lived, saw it as callousness by nature and culture. Because villages were made to work for being of Gypsy or Romani descent, the health impacts of the workers who were forced to actually mine uranium at some points, they were given no protective clothing, so whatever they breathed, they would have to carry the uranium. And there's many sources that suggest that there actually many of the workers had to have tumors removed because they were forced to carry uranium with no protective clothing, no masks, no nothing, uranium on bare skin, causing all sorts of problems for their workers. Bronchiogenic carcinoma was what mainly the miners suffered from. It's a medical condition that is basically causing cancerous tissues to develop on the skin. Many of them died for that. Many of them either had to have some sort of surgery or even fact was proved fatal. This was from carrying the uranium with no protection. Because the Czechs objected to what was going on by the Soviets, they objected socially and environmentally. They knew, the people that lived there knew what they were doing to the environment was nothing short of a disgrace. They knew that what the people in the miners were going through, there was nothing short of a disgrace. So those that cared enough couldn't really do much about it other than leave. So the ones that really did care left. So this basically left the Soviets with a problem where they would have to get another workforce. They couldn't use the villagers because they refused to do it. Many of them were left. So what they would do is bring in uneducated workforce. Many are from a Gypsy background from elsewhere in the Soviet Union. And many of these people had no high school education. So basically what they did, they targeted people so that they couldn't really object because they didn't understand what they were doing, and because they had no ties to the location, they didn't really care what they were doing to the area. You know, they didn't live in Horni Blatna village, they didn't care about the forest and the Black Triangle. They just had a job to do, they were paid some money to do it, so they were happy. So what was going on to the environment and the pollution that was going on kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it became a massive problem. There are quotes of saying that the Soviet managers of the industrialised town were saying that we must breed men who can work in this pollution. So it wasn't the fact that they had to reduce the pollution, it was more the fact they had to find someone that would be happy to work in the pollution. And that's exactly what they found. They found people that are uneducated, you know, very poor, came from poverty. They gave them jobs to do something that no one else wanted to do, and that's how things like this start. I'm now going to talk about particulate emissions. Particulate emissions are basically, in a sentence, killers of the environment and people. Particulate emissions is basically particles that are placed into the air in the form of soot, dirt, just basically the after byproduct of burning fuel, a fuel like lignite that was used, but there are byproducts of burning natural gas, or byproducts of burning coal. But lignite in particular has has a massive amounts of sulfur, and it causes a lot of soot to cloud the atmosphere around the industrialised town. So this fine soot and dust released into the air meant school children would have to wear surgical masks on the way to school. I mean, that's more than what the workers got, but because they thought they were school children, they gave them surgical masks. But they knew what they were doing. They knew that the pollution that was going on was nothing short of a disgrace, but they kept going. To put it in perspective of how much pollutants were being pumped into the air from these factories, that the EPA's requirement for particulate emissions is to not exceed 40 micrograms per cubic metre. Basically, the Black Triangle would reach up to 200. So you're talking up to 5 times as much micrograms per unit of particulate more than what was today readily acceptable. The effects of this were devastating for the people that worked there or even lived there. There are statistics to show that life expectancy of those people that lived in that area and breathed in the air reduced by 7 years to the rest of Europe. So put it in perspective, someone that was living in Western Europe was expected to live 7 years longer than someone that lived in that Black Triangle. And this didn't happen over 4, 5 or 6 generations, it's only happened in 1 generation. So 1 generation change, it meant that you were going to live 7 years less than on average than Western Europe. And also the infant mortality rate, that was 40% higher than anywhere else in Europe. So they're really big changes to only happen in 1 generation of people. Respiratory infections were 5 times greater, and all like I say, all of this was done in 1 generation. So it was a very quick change. It just shows you that how when you pump so much pollution into the air, it doesn't only affect the environment; it affects the people that are living in it. Acid rain, which we'll talk about here, is another byproduct of the factories. Basically, what would happen with the chemicals that are being pumped into the air, sunlight would act as a catalyst to cause this reaction. So when this chemical is floating in the air in water vapour, it goes into the clouds, and then the rain, when it does rain, basically brings all those chemicals back down into the soil, and basically poisons the earth. It doesn't do it any good. It's only a detriment. It's like I said before, it essentially poisons the earth. In that western front forest on the Black Triangle, 115 square miles had to be destroyed because basically the forest had died. It had died because trees did what they were supposed to do. They took what was in the soil and they brought it into their roots and brought it into themselves to help them grow. But what they were bringing in due to the acid rain and the pollutants from the factory was things like aluminium and other phosphorus chemicals that were wouldn't go missing like a science lab, but the trees were bringing that into their roots, and it killed them off. Barrett Rock's research, the researcher that I talked about earlier, his research showed that trees were suffering from something called plasmolysis.